Shivang, I believe we can start now.
Right, sure. For everybody who just joined, happy Dussehra and welcome again to day two of the e-colloquium. Now, the e-colloquium was a collaborative effort that we've started between two organizations. The two organizations, of course, being Project Statecraft, a youth policy think tank, and Rethinking Economics, the India Network. I'll give you a brief on what these particular organizations do, and then I'll move on to introducing your moderator for the day, who will then be taking over the proceedings. Project Statecraft is a non-partisan, youth-led policy think tank and youth organization working in the fields of policy research, education, and youth engagement to produce truthful and equitable initiatives and research. Our research team strives to produce academic publications in the form of papers, reports, policy briefs, opinion editorials, and blogs which stir debate and demand policy action in the areas of global governance, affairs, public policy, and governance. Our events in the form of workshops such as this one, simulations, and seminars, along with our publications, edify the masses about government policies and instances that shape our surroundings. We aim to create opportunities that help to capacitate the students to grow academically, socially, and culturally. We at Project Statecraft aim to build an ecosystem which would encourage the youth to carry out research and participate in deliberations and discussions to best motivate and contrive change. The Rethinking Economics India Network is a national network of global rethinking economics movement. We operate as a nationwide ecosystem of stakeholders in the space of a pluralist and heterodox economics and are looking to interface with individuals, academia, civil society, and other organizations in order to encourage teaching, learning, and discussion for scaling collaborative efforts towards a better, more inclusive economics for India and contribute towards the global movement at large. The e-colloquium is a prime example of such a collaboration between our two organizations. Yesterday, we've had a keynote address on on the inefficiencies in welfare schemes and policymaking in India, and a workshop where you learned with respect to case studies bridging the gap between social issues and policy problems using case method. Now, today we have for you uh, another keynote address in the form of income inequality in India and its implications in development. The moderator for this event is Amrita, who is a representative of Rethinking Economics India, and we are very glad to have you here. Amrita, it's all yours.
Thank you for the introduction, Shivang. I once again want to thank all the attendees for attending our session today, and Professor Sita Prabhu especially, because I mean, owing to the festival, we're very honored to have her spare some time for us. So we'll just jump right in. Professor K. Sita Prabhu is a development economist and visiting professor and senior advisor SDGs, and formerly the Tata Chair Professor at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai, India, and head Human Development Resource Center, UNDP India. She has authored and co-authored several books, including Economic Reform and Social Sector Development, Macroeconomics and Gender, Reforming India's Social Sector, Human Development in an Unequal World, and most recently, Making Development Happen. Dr. Prabhu has been a pioneer of human development reports in India and has done groundbreaking work on inequality sensitive HDI. We're very glad to have you with us, Dr. Prabhu. Hope you're doing well.
Thank you very much.
So, for today's session, we have three primary objectives. Firstly, we want to approach various academic perspectives with regard to understanding inequality. It's an old age concept, and there is a host of literature out there on how to tackle it and understand it better, although we will keep it slightly limited to India and the global south. Secondly, we want to understand the gaps in mainstream economic theories, keeping divisive politics aside, as we understood some of that from yesterday's session, that prevent us from addressing concerns of rising inequality. And lastly, how can we address inequality using alternative economic theories? So before I hand it to you, ma'am, some housekeeping rules. Please put all of your questions in the Q&A box. We will address all of them later. towards the end of the session. And yes, over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much. I think it's a pleasure to have a whole lot of you joining in. And what Jaya has said, that it's, and Ankita has said, that it's a festival day. Thank you, Amrita, for introducing me in such clear terms. My interest in inequality stems from, 2 or 3 reasons. One is that it seems to be one of the most troubling aspects in our current debate globally as well as at the country level. And with the COVID-19 pandemic, I think it has come suddenly to the forefront of the images of migrants walking miles and miles on their own with no support whatsoever, starkly brought to us the situation on the ground where the hidden problems came to the forefront. Globally also, there has been a resurgence of interest in inequality, particularly since the global financial crisis of 2008. And more so when Professor Joseph Stiglitz and Raghuram Rajan famously argued that inequality was a major trigger for the financial crisis in the US, and which of course originated there but snowballed and spread to other countries. We also have Frances Stewart from Oxford, who has been pointing out since 2008 that horizontal inequalities are a potent source of conflict. Others like Mancini have pointed out that group inequalities, particularly in dimensions such as child mortality rate, education, civil service employment, have been triggers for conflict. Coming from a different angle, Nancy Birdsall in 2005 talked of destructive inequalities. Inequality in terms of opportunities. And she said that if inequality exists in a situation or a society with equal opportunities, that may be bearable as long as there is opportunity for mobility of people. It's not considered a problem. But if inequality reflects privileges for the rich and blocks the less rich from contributing to the economy, it would be destructive in nature. Inequality particularly matters for economic growth, where markets are weak, where government institutions are weak, and where social institutions particularly are weak, because it discourages civic and social life that is essential for collective decision making. On another note, Naila Kabir, since mid-2000s, has been talking about the impact of durable inequalities, particularly in the context of Asian countries, where exclusion, social structural factors such as identity seem to be overwhelming the economic factors in leading to inequalities being deeply entrenched and persistent. Gender inequalities in particular are deep and durable across generations as well. Now, since 2005, the scholarly studies of Milanovic, Piketty, and Chancel have talked of the role of capital and institutions, the legal system, the educational system, the fiscal system that helps sustain a certain level of equality or inequality in a given society. Even prior to this, there's been a lot of literature pointing to inequality being harmful for growth. In 2000, the Barrows paper is quite well read and cited. The evidence also from OECD countries shows that rise in inequality between 1990 and 2010 actually led to a reduction in the growth prospects of countries like Mexico. Now, when we start talking about inequality being harmful for growth, it somehow upsets the apple cart of economic growth and raises many more questions. Because for long, people like Amartya Sen, who have believed in the ethical moorings of development, have been arguing that inequality in opportunity is just unjust. And he called for re-examining inequality and raised pertinent questions about equality of what for as far back as 1992. Now, responding to this interest in inequality, you find in recent times a spate of reports on inequality from Oxfam, UNDP, World Bank, ILO, and so on. So there seems to be talk of inequality everywhere. Moreover, the formulation of the SDG process, which lobbied and successfully incorporated SDG 10, the reduction in all forms of inequality, both at the national and international level as a goal, brought it straight to the central table of policy debate and policy action across countries to tackle inequality. The most important question for me is that there are so many viewpoints on inequality, but what is the lens that we adopt to examine the issue of inequality? Is it from an instrumental perspective, that it affects growth, it is bad for social cohesion, it triggers conflict, and so on? Or is it from the point of view of justice and fairness? Do ethical considerations have anything to do with us wanting to have less inequality in a society? Do we want a society where huge inequalities in incomes and in education, health, and opportunities are avoided, where initial inequality in endowments is somehow mitigated through various measures, where unfair institutions and legal systems do not block the upward mobility of individuals? Or are we only bothered about inequality in terms of income? Inequality today in various aspects is the result of past policies. And that should be remembered, that what we are examining today is what we decided and deliberately took a path towards one way or the other 2 decades ago. One important point that I want to remind, particularly since we have many young students here, not so long ago, at the beginning, at the beginning of the discipline of economics, it was a branch of ethics. Now, I don't know how many people would be aware of this. It was a branch of ethics, and it was more moral philosophy. Even Adam Smith, who is the guru of the market economy, talked of the dignity of the individual and poverty, where individuals are, poverty he described as where an individual is able to appear in public without shame. So I think the dignity of the individual and the minimum basic requirements of the individual are an important ethical foundation of economics itself. Later on, as the engineering branch of economics took over the economics profession, you will find that we opted more and more for ethical models, elegant models, and the ethical foundations were somehow packed and seem to have confined to a narrow branch of welfare economics, and after which it looked like economics could proceed unhindered, bothered by many of these questions. So it is to the credit of Amartya Sen to have brought back these issues to the forefront. Now, when we do not have a perspective of justice and fairness and so on, you see what happens. The unbridled faith that we had in the Kuznets curve. Now, if you look at the Kuznets curve, which talked of, the famous in 1955 when Simon Kuznets proposed this or observed this tendency across 3 economies, actually. No one seems to remember that. It was just 3 countries that he took, USA, UK, and Germany, with data from 1870s to 1940s. And he looked at the relationship between inequality as measured by the Gini coefficient and income growth. And it seemed to indicate that initial levels of economic development, growth, the inequality will go up, income inequality, after which, after a certain point, it will start falling. And therefore, it's an inverted U curve. Now, this particular measure, when you're looking at the empirical evidence across a few countries, and then you generalized, newly emerging countries of the post-Second World War period seem to have got enamored by this concept, and they could justify the single-minded focus on economic growth, which was a need of the hour, and looked at it as an infallible law, so that they did not have to bother about inequality at all till the economic growth and per capita income rises to a certain level. Now, the results of that were evident by the 1970s, and by 1980s, poverty and inequality became issues that needed to be looked at. Look at the scandalous sort of results that the Oxfam reports put out. Shocking facts. The World Inequality Report and Oxfam report for 2020 highlight that in 2020, the world's 2,153 billionaires had more wealth than 4.6 billion people, who are 60% of the world's population. In the mid-2019, the bottom half of the world population account for less than 1% of the total wealth, whereas the top 10% possess 82% of the global wealth. And actually the top 1% had as much as 45% of all assets. The richest 10% accounted for 46% of growth in emissions also, whereas the poorest 50% accounted for about 6%. This type of inequality, of extreme inequality, is what we are talking about, and where it is a trigger for social unrest also. ILO in its 2020 World Employment and Social Outlook report indicates that the social unrest index is rising in 7 out of 11 sub-regions. Inequalities and access to work and work opportunities seem to have work quality, segmentation among workers, and different situations in different geographies and rural-urban differences, etc., all seem to matter. So the focus now has turned to sustainable development. I think, Amrita, can you put on the slide? Hello?
Yes, ma'am, I'm just.
Yeah, in the, can you see it fully? Yeah. In this framework, what we are trying to say is that sustainable development, sustainability and equity are two sides of the same coin. When you're looking at sustainability, I take the Brundtland definition of economic, social, and environmental dimensions. And in equity, you look at intragenerational and intergenerational dimensions. Intergenerational dimension is what sustainability is all about. When you look at it on all three areas, though normally there is a tendency to equate and sustainability with only environmental sustainability. We are also looking at vertical and horizontal, inequalities, though the discussion normally is only on vertical inequalities. And it's not about group inequality, except since Francis Stewart has been focusing much more on how the inequalities between groups seems to be a potent source of conflict. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is the slide on the SDG 10. You will see that it's a very broad interpretation of inequality. It takes into account various aspects and how it is connected, interlinked with education, health, water, poverty, hunger, energy, infrastructure, gender, employment, and so on. So it's very multidimensional connections of inequality that it affects deeply each of these. It affects society, it affects economy, it affects environment. And it, therefore, unless you tackle inequality in all its dimensions and not be focused only on one dimension, which is only income inequality, there does not seem to be any possibility of reducing inequalities in the near future. Yeah. Next, please. I want to come to the India story, given the time, previous one, please. Yeah. I want to come to the India story. Now, generally in India, it is considered that inequality is not so much of a problem because the Gini coefficient is only 0.36. And I'm sorry to be using only the data for 2012. As you know, the NSS consumption expenditure data for the later years has not been released. So we are severely constrained in analyzing this issue of inequality because of data constraints. And we have only up to 2012 that the NSS data is available. You find that inequality is considered low by international standards. But if you look at this graph, you find when you take income inequality, as you know, in India, inequality is measured using consumption expenditure. And consumption expenditure is always an underestimate of the inequalities that are there because the expenditure at the top end is not captured adequately. And in any case, there's a smoothing of inequalities when you use consumption expenditure. When you take income data, which is available from the India Human Development Survey data, you'll find that in many of the states, the Gini coefficient is higher than 0.5. These are states of Gujarat, Karnataka, I think it's also Kerala, Andhra Pradesh, and so on. And this is much higher than these Latin American countries of Colombia, Peru, and so on, which are considered to be high inequality countries globally. So it is not as if inequality in India is low. It is just that we are using different measures. The reason why I call this inequality talk a conundrum is also because there are a whole lot of issues connected with the measurement of inequality. Which dimension do you take? How do you measure? What are the weights that you use? Is it population weighted and so on? So the whole issue becomes masked by the methodological issues as well as the definitional issues. Next, please. If you look at the wealth inequalities, of course, they are much more huge. And I think we had to take the 20%, bottom 20%, this is the top 20%, is in 1991. Whereas now, if you see in 2012, ever since the reforms that we have had from liberalization and so on, you find that the wealth inequalities have increased much more. So about 63% of the per capita asset value is in the top 10% of the households, whereas the bottom has literally no assets whatsoever. Next, please. The top 1% national income share in India, 1922 to 2015, you see a clear trend from 1980, but much more since 1990, the onset of the reforms as it were. And I also want to just quip a little, taking advantage of my age, that in the 60s and 70s, when you said reforms, you always meant redistributive reforms, land reforms and asset distribution. Those were called reforms. Now, when you say reforms, I'm sure your generation has no doubt in your mind that they are market reforms, something that gives importance to the market, not so much to redistribution. So the 1% top 1% income share has increased tremendously. Next, please. Whereas the bottom 50%, you see how it goes. It's been completely a downward trend since 1990. The share, it's not the incomes. Incomes are going up, but the share as the national income is growing, who benefits, who are the winners, and the top 1%, top 10% seem to be the winners, whereas the bottom seems to be losing out in terms of relative share. Next, please. What's the story here? You find that the share of profits, when you look at it from the factor income point of view, the share of profits has been rising tremendously, whereas the share of wages in total net value added has been either stagnant or slightly declining as well. So that who is the person who benefits? The one who has the capital, the one who has labor and labor power to actually offer. It seems to have lost out because the wages are not rising in proportion to the productivity increases. Next, please. Here you find the rural and the urban. The urban incomes are rising faster than the rural incomes. And even within urban, ILO has argued that there are increasing inequality between the top and the bottom half of the people. The highly skilled people are getting wages, salaries far higher than those with limited skills or low skills. And therefore, the inequality, even within the urban sector, among the salaried is also rising rapidly. Next, please. This is a graph that we have from our book, Human Development in an Unequal World. This is the Gini coefficient and the HDI, and you will find the countries here. Generally, the countries with high Gini coefficient seem to be performing, having low Human Development Index values. And many of these are African countries, where some of these in this group, in the B, are also Asian countries. You'll find countries like Indonesia, Philippines, and so on, also bunched up here, which seem to indicate that the higher the income inequality in a country, the lower will be the HDI value. At least they seem to be going together. Yes, next, please. The UNDP since 2010 has been putting out an inequality adjusted human development index because averages don't seem to make sense. And here comes the true story. Now, almost 1/4 of the value of the human development index is lost if we were to adjust it for inequality, even if we were to take only 3 dimensions. It is inequality in income, inequality in educational attainments, and inequality in health attainments. You find, and surprisingly, what I want to point out here, that the loss due to inequality in education, this is not something that is seen very often or understood very often. There seems to be the largest largest loss seems to be in 38.7% seems to be in the education dimension, whereas it's not so much in life expectancy or in the income index. It's much higher. And also income, India ranks at 129 out of 158 countries, the commitment to reduce inequality index of Oxfam. And now this is an index where you cannot have welfare policies to address poverty and inequality or some reservations. That is good. But then if the general economic process and the paradigm you're following creates more inequalities, then addressing them at the margin will not yield any results. The process of development has to be such that it includes agriculture, it includes small and medium industries, it includes the people with the skills, enhances the skills of the people and so on. Otherwise, it will not be a redistributive ethos, as I told you, that you have restricted access to forests, you have acquired land of the tribals, and then you cannot expect equity to happen. Now, third, and this is the most important, enhancing capabilities is a long-term process, which requires investment in social sectors over decades. You cannot expect overnight results of improving educational outcomes. The ASER reports have repeatedly pointed out how terrible are whatever education that is acquired also, how the outcomes are, where the quality of education is so poor. Most of the countries that have invested in education and health, it has been a long-term process over decades, if not centuries, that has led them to the situation where they are. Lastly, the various sectors that contribute to the enhancement of social opportunities and freedoms must be addressed in an integrated manner. This seems sort of commonsensical, but I can assure you it's not commonsensical. I'll end with this last example that I want to give. A recent documentation that is being done on SDG localization at the Taluka level in Maharashtra, that is led by my co-author, Dr. Sandhya Iyer from TILS, indicated the peculiar situation. There are schemes and schemes. For every sector, there are a whole lot of schemes. At the Taluka level for health and nutrition, we identified at least 20 schemes that were being implemented, and with various ministries and departments. You'll find that it involves the human HRD ministry, it involves women and child department, child welfare department, it involves the Ayush department, and so on. So midday meal is by HRD, Amrutahar Yojana in tribal areas, Bal Sanjeevani, Bal Swasthya, which is screening of children for health conditions. And the health programs are all vertical disease-oriented programs. TB control, HIV AIDS control, epidemic control, eradication of leprosy, control of blindness, and so on. If you have these types of vertical programs, obviously community health is not going to be tackled in an integrated manner. And as it is spent very little, about 1% of the total public budget on health. And within that, if there is a split across various diseases, obviously the results are not going to be anything other than what we already have. So I'll stop here and maybe we can take up in the discussion. Finally, I just want to say, it's the last slide, please. Next, yeah, thanks. Okay. What I would like to highlight is that inequality is pervasive. Inequality is multidimensional. Inequality is something which is deeply entrenched. It is not just a residual problem. And what we are tackling are actually huge numbers, 200 odd million illiterate, so about 1/3 of the children undernourished and so on. If you want to tackle this type of inequality, you cannot have residual policies or welfare policies alone tackling this. You need monetary policies, you need fiscal policies, you need all policies to have a redistributive ethos and try and bridge the inequality. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. That was indeed very insightful, some very interesting research, and it's left, I'm sure, all of our attendees with lots of food for thought, as is evident in our question and answer box. I think we'll get straight to it now. So the first question is, could you please talk about how compatible is correcting income or economic inequality with the capability approach of looking at it? How radical is the idea to not directly reduce gaps in income, but to ensure equal access to basic services and ensure the dignity of the citizens?
The answer now?
Yes, yes, ma'am. We'll go one by one.
It's necessary to see. See, income is what? It reflects, income inequality reflects actually inequalities in various other dimensions as well. It is not as if it's only income. I mean, you can see income as an outcome, or you can see, look at it as a means. I look at income as a means to achieve something else that you consider valuable in life. As Amartya Sen said, the capability approach is all about it's a set of, functionings, that valuable beings and doings of people. Now, by addressing education, I would like to highlight over and over again that basic education, universal education for all, and not just the up to fifth standard or that we seem to be looking at, but at least 10 to 12 years of good quality public education, publicly funded education is a must for the redistributive ethos to kick in. You have the stark example of South Korea and Mexico. Can you imagine South Korea had an income level which was lower than that of Mexico in 1965? And by 1985-90, the situation was reversed. While there were many other factors that influenced this outcome, at least one very important factor was that South Korea had publicly funded education. It had higher levels of secondary education. Mexico had literate population, but it had fewer years of secondary education, about 7 or 8 years as compared to 10 to 12 years of South Korea. And that enabled, what did it enable? It enabled new technology to be adopted faster. Workers could be trained into the adoption of new technology, and it emerged as a leader. Similarly, you also find that the innovation index and the technological knowledge that India and China, they were at similar levels in the 90s. Yet China went far ahead. Apart from other things, it also has much higher innovations, much higher patents, whereas India seemed to be lagging behind. So I think education is one redistributive factor that can lead enhancing capabilities. Education also leads to better child nutrition outcomes, as it has been proved. Education of women also leads to better health awareness and health practices. So I think we needed to focus. If we couldn't do land reform because it was politically troublesome, then at least we could have done much more on the education front and provided good quality education to all so that everyone has an equal opportunity to move up. Intergenerational inequality could have been reduced. As long as we view it as welfare, it will not happen.
Right. Okay, so our next question is, if you could give us some insights from your time at the UNDP, ma'am, if you saw some cases wherein there were nations which were on the similar levels as India with respect to labor or resources, but which moved on different trajectories due to their policies or the implementation, just to like have an idea of something that we could have achieved, or if it's not too late, we still can get there.
Bangladesh, look at Bangladesh. Bangladesh has so much better maternal health outcomes. It has achieved much better health outcomes in India. Now we are also talking of it's achieving much greater economic growth than India. So I think one of the countries which has systematically worked on empowering the women and looking at the health sector is Bangladesh. You also have at where South Korea. I still go back again to the way in which, and also to the other East Asian countries, where land reform was implemented right in the beginning. Focus was on agriculture, so that the incomes of the majority increased. In Malaysia, for example, they tackled the inequalities between the Bhumiputras and the others by as affirmative policies. Affirmative policies are good, but they have to be accompanied by redistributive policies. If you're just affirmative action, like we have reservations, but we do not have anything that enhances the incomes of the marginalized communities to the same extent as in other countries. So if you do not have the range of policies, you will not be in a position to reduce these inequalities. Similarly, in Latin America, you have the conditional cash transfer programs, which integrated the cash transfer to households and connected them with school attendance, connected them with health outcomes.
Right. Okay.
Somewhat answered?
Yes, absolutely.
And even within India, why do we have to go far? Even within India, you find Kerala is far ahead of many other states, and Tamil Nadu, cheap rice program in Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu have ensured better nutritional outcomes there as compared to others.
Correct. So another question from Shivani Bhargav. She's saying that you've mentioned gender inequalities, and given that women's domestic labor is not traditionally considered work, do you think that women's position in society should be seen from a purely economic perspective? Or is there a need to interrogate economic categories of what constitutes work?
Yeah, I think there is a huge movement now on time use surveys with CSO also being sensitized to it. If the time of women were, I mean, this is, see, the only reason you're talking of income and the monetary aspect is because this is the language that economists seem to be most comfortable with traditionally. That there are estimates saying that if women's work were to be valued at the same rates at the market, then India's per capita, India's GDP would soar by 20%, 30%, and so on. So I think these estimates are useful just to highlight the extent to which women's work is undervalued. But I think the dignity of women, and as an equal citizen and equal participant in the economy, in society, and the apart from the nurturing role, there is a contribution that the woman can make. And as in the capabilities approach, we say that whatever you think is valuable and your ability and the freedom to choose, ultimately what is equality? Equality is in the freedom to choose the way you want to live and the way you can attain things that you consider valuable. Now, do women, many of us here are, I don't know how many participants are women here, but do we have the freedom? The younger generation certainly has more freedom than the older ones may be. But even now it varies across regions, it varies across societies, it varies across communities. So I think a woman in her own right, what she wants to do, what her choices are, who asks her what her choice is. There seems to be no choice for women that is presented. I think a society where women are valued, their opinions are valued, their choices are valued, and they have the freedom to pursue the life that they want. Whether they want to work in the occupational categories that we talk about, or they do not want to work, it is their choice. But they should have that choice. And the dignity. I think for me, dignity is the utmost important.
Yeah. So it all comes down to ethics and what we value more in a society.
I think economics has moved away from ethics. Please, the younger generation, please remember, we were actually part of the ethics discipline. We moved away and we have confined it to welfare economics, bundled it and put it there and then not bothered about it. Engineering branch seem to fascinate us more, elegant models, but they're not, life is not an elegant model, it's complex. Yeah.
So another question, ma'am. Sociologists often discuss the role of cultural and social capital in furthering inequality. What is an economic perspective on this?
No, I think the economic perspective is coming to accept you. One great service that the capability approach has done is that you have the how you translate the opportunities that you have into reality depends very much on your personal factors, your cultural factors, your social factors. The bicycle example is very often used in the capabilities approach. There might be a bicycle, which is a resource, but how do you use it? Whether you're able to use it depends on whether you're able to ride it, whether you're physically fit to ride it. You also need to know whether a girl is able to ride it in a village. What are the social and cultural factors that are inhibiting her? So there are certain, and what is the milieu within which a person operates? Because the sun preference, for example, is it the person's revealed preference or their adapted preferences due to social pressure? There is social pressure, that is their social norms. And as long as you adhere to those social norms, maybe you adapt your preferences and after a while, you are not even aware of what your preferences are because they're so colored by the milieu that you have. That some people are very happy. If you do not know what freedom is, then you cannot even visualize it. If someone allows you to work, then you feel you're very, very privileged. If someone allows you to move out of the house, you feel you're very privileged, you're lucky. So the very fact that you need not seek permission is something that is not ingrained in the minds of women.
Indeed.
So the cultural factors and social factors are most crucial.
Yes, yes, ma'am, that was very enlightening, that answer. So another question is, wealth inequality is much more severe than income inequality when it's felt on the ground. Can you speak something about that with regards to taxation?
Yeah, of course,
Or
progressive
something?
taxation is now given a go by. We've said tax holiday to wealth tax. We are reducing because we want the capitalists to invest more and more. We want to attract more investment and to make it easy and easy. But there is no consideration that this leads to durable inequalities or intergenerational inequality or persistent inequality, because most of the billionaires of our country have inherited the wealth. There are very few, very small proportion was self-made. Huge amounts of wealth that are inherited, and wealth tax not being progressive, either abolition of wealth tax or very low levels in many countries, shows that you're allowing this, you're making a choice to say that we are okay with wealth inequality. I think it's completely unfair to have to reward productivity, to reward innovation, to reward enterprise is very good. But then to allow that initial advantage to be carried over generations and to distort all other things is can't be defended. We need progressive taxation, but no political party has the gumption to take it on.
Right. So earlier you mentioned you wanted to speak about Sen. I will ask you if you could comment something about the Bhagwati versus Sen debate that erupted in 2014. You know, we have seen a lot of changes with respect to that, to the debate and where it has evolved. What are your views on it, ma'am?
No, I think Sen has steadfastly held to the view that capabilities matter. Well, he is not against economic growth. I mean, none of the capability wallahs are against economic growth or against the functioning of the economy as such. But it is just that you consider this equally important, if not more important. And any economic growth that takes place without taking people into account and without considering their capabilities and enhancing the foundational aspects of development. After all, development for whom? Mehboob Haq had asked this question long ago. Development for whom? Ultimately, is it for the economy? Is it for us? And he also asked for standing economic theory on its head. I think that's exactly what we need to do. We seem to have placed economic growth on an altar and pay homage to it, and that at any cost. But growth for whom? And growth for what? If the people are not, if the majority of the people are not going to benefit from it, and it's only the top 10% that is going to benefit from it, is this the type of economic growth that we really require? I think this is the fundamental question. Whoever might, raise the issue, I think this is the issue. And the global economy is not the global scenario has also to contribute. Rich countries and weak countries, the global politics. This also has to change, and the global institutions have to be playing a more active role in ironing out inequalities. Look at the MDG way, the Millennium Development Goals, and even the SDGs. There is no commitment of the rich countries to part with resources for the benefit of uplifting poverty, reducing inequality across the world. The 0.8% target of GDP has never been met. And no one seems to be talking about it also. So I think, and the environmental situation, I could not mention the environmental situation, but I think the more and more we neglect environment, the burden is going to fall disproportionately on the poor and the marginalized. The climate change effects are already there for us to see.
So another question, ma'am. How group identity is the key to addressing inequality, and how inequality can disrupt group identity? Can the concepts of uncertainty, power, and institutions replace the concepts of individual and rationality to better understand inequality?
I don't think it's an either or question. You are part of you are an individual, but are you not part of a group? Do you not share an identity with the group? Are you devoid individual without any, any other connections or any other identity? All of us have multiple identities, right? You belong to a group, you belong to a class, you belong to a society, you belong to a country. So there are group identities. Now, simple things like distribution of electricity, child mortality differences. These have triggered, when Frances Stewart and her entire group that is working on this have shown that these have been one of the fundamental causes for triggering conflict across groups. It may not be something very, very big that you think, not territorial disputes. There might be very simple things of access to water that have triggered conflicts across groups. So I think group identity is important, and individual enterprise and the entire capability approach is also criticized, saying that it's an individual oriented. It doesn't take into account anything else, as if individual freedom is everything. But it is subject to social norms, and social norms can also be oppressive. It's also subject to the prevailing social environment. So I think we cannot be diverse from the social milieu in which we are brought up. We cannot be diverse from the political economy within which we are functioning. And you see the power play everywhere. The individual enterprise, individual freedom are most valued in the capability approach, but it is also recognizes that you are a part of a group, and therefore the group identity and the group, and if you are a marginalized group like the scheduled tribes, then what do? How much will an individual freedom or individual enterprise matter there? You're pulled down by your initial conditions already. You're dispossessed of your land. You do not have any voice. You do not have any bargaining power. You are unable to access the higher quality education and better quality education. There's a heartening story of a person from Melghat who has cleared the NEET, the medical entrance exam. Those are very exceptional ones. Otherwise, you find they're trapped in this poverty capability trap. And group identity, therefore, and if they're traditionally disadvantaged, I think equity demands that you give them preferential treatment, not only in terms of jobs and in terms of education, but also in terms of enhancing their incomes.
So we're almost nearing our time, ma'am. But I'm thinking if you would be okay with answering one or two more questions.
Okay.
We won't be able to answer. Take all of them because there are lots of questions here for you.
Which topic? I must tell you, it's not possible to do justice in half an hour and 20 minutes. I think.
Yes, ma'am.
Amenable to convenient slots that are required by discussion formats these days. Yeah.
Yes, just one or two questions, if you're okay with that, if you wouldn't mind. There's a case here. Why is the Gini coefficient of Kerala so high, even though its rates of poverty are low?
Well, the inequality is high in terms of education, health. It has done well, but I think it has a lot to do with the remittance incomes that are coming. Kerala's economy is spearheaded and propelled by remittance incomes, and that is one aspect. And even within Kerala, there are pockets where there is acute deprivation. The fishermen in Kerala in pockets are extremely deprived. So I think that plays up. The Gini coefficient is basically an income component that you're looking at. And the earnings differentials between those who have been able to get better opportunities abroad and those who have had to remain within the low-paying occupations within the country seems to be reflecting in the higher Gini coefficient. The consumption doesn't indicate that. The income indicates that much more.
Yes, ma'am. So another question, I think, does sustainability include structural change?
Well, structural change, see, sustainability, first of all, includes three aspects: economic, social, environmental. Okay, now when you're looking at social, you will certainly want a structural change. In which sense, I don't know, because economists talk of structural change of moving from agriculture to industry in the way the share of national income coming from agriculture going down, that of industry and tertiary going up, and so on. You're talking of structural factors that are influencing inequality, and in which case, yes, because it is a myth to say that let the size of the cake grow and we will divide it after the cake is larger. Once the cake is larger, there are vested interests which will not allow you to change the status quo. So if you have to do any redistribution, it's better done at the early stages of development rather than at later stages. Afterwards, it is impossible unless you focus on education once again, unless you make it so enabling that people are able to pursue education, get better employment opportunities, and increase their incomes, then the intergenerational issue will come down. Sustainability is nothing but looking across generations, right? Whereas inequality, the way we are talking about income inequality and so on, is within the generation. So it's intra-generational is what we are discussing, whereas there's a huge intergenerational issue. We have depleted all the resources on the planet, so it left nothing for the next generation. That's also an issue of equity, right? Intergenerational equity is basically equity. What is sustainability except equity across generations?
Yes, ma'am, yes. Yes. Very, very great. So with that, we'll come to an end of our session. Uh, it has been wonderful having you, ma'am. This session, I'm sure, is going to be all the more memorable because of the event and the occasion. And not every day we get the chance to interact with you. So we're very grateful once again, ma'am, on behalf of Rethink Economics India Network and PSC, Project Statecraft. Some shameless promotion. We have put up sites, links. All the attendees, they can follow us on our social media pages, handles. And if you all want to join us or volunteer work with us, you can get more information on our websites. Yes, I think that's about it. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Much. Thanks to all of you and all the participants. And just one last word, if I may say, please
Yes.
change. I have a plea, like a mandatory plea at the end of every talk. Let's change the development language that we are using. Let's not use terms of interventions, targets, beneficiaries. Let's start using the term participant, initiative, participant, and those types of more friendly terms rather than using
more intangible aspects of.
Well, I think aspects, they're participants, they're not beneficiaries, they're not targets. They're more, the co-creators of a development initiative. So this is one mandatory thing that I thought I'd say at the end of every talk, so that once our language changes, our viewpoint may change sometime.
Yes, ma'am. Here's hoping to that. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone. Bye, ma'am.
Bye.